Let me tell you a story. Once upon a time, in a land far away, there was a father, let's call him Abraham, who was looking for a wife for his son, let's call his son Isaac. He sent his servant, let's call him servant, off with specific details: where to go, who to speak to, what to say. Servant did as he was told, and everything went to plan. The chosen young girl, let's call her Rebecca, was willing to leave her family straight away and go to the new land to find her husband. I'm a bit of a romantic, so the next bit it stirs my heart. Rebecca's camel was saddled and loaded for the journey, and she set off. Now, don't get me wrong, camels are not romantic. They are bumpy and uncomfortable, they smell and make strange noises, and they can just sit down in the middle of the road when they feel like it and refuse to move. However, Rebecca's camel got her to her new land. And as she was approaching her future husband's country, she looked up, and there he was meditating in a field. Isaac looked up just at the same time and saw Rebecca. It was love at first sight. Isaac brought Rebecca to the tent of his mother, and Rebecca became his wife, and he loved her. That's the romantic bit. And that's where our Bible reading begins. Rebecca was barren, so Isaac prayed for his wife, and she conceived. The story's going well, with all the promise of a happy family. Or is it? As we have already heard in our Bible reading tonight, our happy family won't continue to be happy. Our reading tells us that the twins struggled in the womb. And when Rebecca inquired of God, he told her what was going to happen with her sons in the future. Remember that. God was already part of the family, understanding what was happening. We see the first sign of a break in the family as the boys were growing up. Isaac and Rebecca played favourites. Isaac loved Esau and Rebecca loved Jacob. The family is already going separate ways. Poor choices were beginning to be made. Esau sells his birthright for a meal. Now, this does seem ridiculous, doesn't it? I can imagine Jacob and Esau having a transaction over a meal. I can remember my kids deciding who would wash up and would they take their turn and they do it another night. Never worked out. But over a meal, but to give his birthright and for Jacob to willingly take it seems to show something about the brothers' characters already. Esau and Jacob already knew what this meant. They both knew how important birthright was. The eldest son received his birthright. He would then become head of the household spiritually. He inherited many material possessions, and it brought with it the promise of the covenant with God. Once given, it couldn't be taken back. Esau gave this up for a meal. When Esau burst out with a loud and bitter cry when he learns not only the birthright but the blessing has been given to Jacob, he cannot blame anyone but himself. It seems no one told Isaac about this selling of the birthright. Secrets are already being kept in the family. When I first read this story, I was really angry with Rebecca for the way she helps the family to fall apart. It just doesn't seem the right thing for a mother to do. Rebecca seems to easily deceive the husband who loved her. She helps Jacob deceive his father so he can receive the blessing meant for Esau. She actually encourages him to deceive and helps him to do that deception. The private transaction between the two boys becomes a semi-public transaction over the blessing. Rebecca was the one who heard God speak, remember? Rebecca demands Jacob listen to her. When Jacob thinks maybe it isn't the right thing to do, she continues to encourage him. Even when Isaac begins doubting whether this is really Esau or not, there is time for Jacob and his mother to pull out of the trickery. lies, secrecy, trickery, manipulation all too quickly became part of the family. And remember, God already had a plan which Rebecca knew. None of this scheming was necessary. The narrator doesn't explain how or why all this happens. The story speaks for itself. Such a good character sketch, not only for that family, but perhaps we are like that when we think about how we like to organise God's plans. There is much more to the story of Esau and Jacob, and some of it you'll hear next week. As we've heard the stories from Genesis this year, they have been building a picture of what God is like and the nation God is forming. We learnt about how our origin story played out. God forms us and walks beside us. We need to follow God. Instead, we put ourselves first and forget that God is God and we are not. But God continues to respond with grace, and we are given opportunities to change. God has reminded us of their goodness in our covenant rainbow, and we saw a beautiful rainbow driving to church this evening. Went right across the sky. These stories tell us the realities about ourselves and God, as well as possibilities. We also need to remember these stories are being written by an ancient people to be read by an ancient people, and now we are reading them and trying to make sense. The point of each ancient story is indeed to tell a story, to show God working through history with love and compassion, despite people's lies, secrets, poor choices. God is faithful, a God who keeps his promises. As these stories of Genesis were being written, Israel, the nation, were an exiled people. Jewish scholars think it would have been written whilst Israel was exiled in Babylon. The Israelites needed to make sense of and remember their past. They needed to be reminded how they got into the mess they were currently in, how they failed to be faithful to God, who continued to be faithful to them. So we see Genesis as Israel's story, written in a light of national trauma, of exile, to encourage continued faithfulness to God, connecting an ancient audience with a past marked by God's goodness and love. Jewish writers explore the story of Jacob and Esau, interpreting their rivalry as a symbolic struggle between competing forces, with Jacob representing the chosen people and Esau representing the Edomites. They also explore themes of power, deception, and reconciliation. We haven't seen the reconciliation in this story, but it will come. They talk about this story as a struggle between two different paths, one of spiritual growth and covenant with God, and the other of worldly pursuits and potential conflict. Jacob becomes a person through whom God creates his chosen people, Israel. The nation of Israel was born out of a dysfunctional family. I think that's important to remember. Interestingly, Jewish families might fight, quarrel with each other, but still remain a family. Families are important and not to be treated lightly. Certainly today, our concept of the family has changed in our modern society. Do we too easily turn from our family and find another family that we find easier to fit in with? Sometimes we may not have a choice, certainly. But do we look before we leap? What does it mean to choose family in full recognition of the problems we might indeed face? We're now left with all kinds of questions, but also many things to consider. God continues to work through the raw human material that is available, and that's what we are. We're the raw human material. God is there in the midst, understanding the pain, the injustice of it. God looks past the inadequacies of people, that's us, our inadequacies, to bring order out of chaos. Not to condone bad behaviour, but draw attention to God's goodness. I like Walter Brueggemann's words when talking about this passage. He says, Jacob is a scandal from the beginning. Yet the powerful grace of God is also a scandal. It upsets the way we would organise life. Whether we believe this is a story about this family and is exactly what happened, or we see it as a bigger story of God telling about the nation of Israel, or do we see it being reflected in our own family stories? However we see it, it is making some powerful points. Present and future are both informed by past. We can't just change that. I've been reading a little book by John Donoghue, who's a Celtic mystic, and he says, even when we are tired and weary of the patterns of our own thinking, they still shape our vision and guide our action. But we need to think about how our actions now play a part in the future and in our future families. It's not easy. Who is God calling us to be? What would it mean to trust God for our future with our family? It's something I've thought a lot about. Coming from a family that was highly dysfunctional and now trying with my own family for it not to be so, it's not always easy, but trusting God to see what might happen. The way of God will not always be explained. We may know that, but we may know that God is holding on to us with powerful grace. The gospel message in this passage seems really clear to me. As we wrestle with our own messy families, with the secrets and lies and poor choices, which have often been made long before we became part of the family, we need to look for a glimpse of God in our midst. We need to wait to listen to God's voice. Then we can perhaps catch the possibilities for us to allow God to shape us into God's desire for our lives. Out of messy families can come great nations.